Good evening. How are you this evening? I'm sorry. I seem to be having some problems with my allergies this evening. My nose keeps running, but I hope I can uh, read the book without too much problem this evening. It's a very different book than I've been reading the past couple, well, for all of the books we've read so far. This one is actually a chapter book. There are only 5 chapters in it, and they're very thin chapters. We'll see how long it takes, whether I read all of it or just part of it tonight. But part of the reason I wanted to read this is I've been talking with the fourth graders at lunch the last 2 weeks, and I have one more group of fourth graders to meet with. We've been talking about leadership, and today I realized actually it's more being good role models that I want the students to think about how they can be good role models. I'm looking forward to next year. One of the things I'd like to do is have teams from the beginning of the year and have the fifth graders help in leading the teams. The teams would probably eat lunch together once a week or every other week at chapel, maybe sit together, maybe once a month have a special activity on a Friday afternoon, maybe doing some sort of games together or activities, maybe even at recess time. If it's a rainy day, especially a rainy day recess, maybe one team could be in one classroom and a different team in a different classroom, and just working together and building some leadership skills, helping people to be good role models. And so this evening, I'm reading a book about Colin Powell, who was a soldier in the United States, and then he had several other positions. He worked in the government. The book was written in 2003, so it's 2019, so that's 16 years ago. So that the things happen. I believe he's still alive, and I guess I should have checked that before I started this. But whether he's alive today or not, he was a man who we can learn from. And many times we can learn about leadership and being good role models. So this is Colin Powell. It Can Be Done. And the first chapter is Courage Under Fire. Let me put my glasses back on. Retired General Colin Powell learned many lessons as an officer in the U.S. Army. Some of those lessons he learned on battlefields. His first battlefield lesson came in the Vietnam War. That was in 1954 to 1975. In Vietnam, Colin learned about fear, loneliness, and death. But he also learned about leadership. And here is a picture of some of the Vietnamese soldiers going through a river, facing fear. In 1962, the U.S. Army sent Colin Powell to South Vietnam. The countries of North and South Vietnam were at war. Colin went to South Vietnam to give advice to its army. North Vietnam had a communist government. The United States did not want it to take over South Vietnam. One day, Colin was on patrol with the South Vietnamese soldiers. Together, they walked all day through hot, sunless forests. Often, they struggled through thick mud. Thick clouds of insects attacked them. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. At the front of the line, someone screamed. Colin was scared, but he moved toward the scream. He saw a wounded soldier. Another soldier lay in a stream. He was dead. The Viet Cong had ambushed them. Fear and loneliness. After the attack, Colin felt a deep loneliness, but he had no one to tell. He didn't speak the Vietnamese language. Colin wondered why he was even in Vietnam. He hardly knew this country. Why was he ready to die for it? The next morning, Colin woke up with the sun splashing across his face. He felt oddly joyful. For some reason, the world seemed less scary. Still today, Colin recalls that morning. That memory got me through many a dark night, Colin says. Protecting his patrol. Soldiers at the front of a patrol face special danger. Colin tried to get them to put on bulletproof vests. The vests were heavy and hot. The soldiers didn't like them. One day, shots again rang out, but this time Colin heard laughter. At the front of the patrol, a Vietnamese soldier giggled. This soldier had on a vest. The vest had a large dent in the back. The soldiers passed around a flattened bullet. The vest had saved the soldier's life. From then on, the soldiers treated Colin with greater respect. So this shows the South China Sea, and here's Cambodia and Thailand and Laos, and this is North Vietnam and South Vietnam. A second time, Colin returned home from Vietnam in 1963. In 1968, he went back to fight in the war. While there, he was in a helicopter crash. Colin broke his ankle, but still helped to save others. He received the Soldier's Medal for his actions. While Colin was in Vietnam, one U.S. soldier wrote a letter that claimed he had seen some U.S. soldiers mistreating the Vietnamese people. He feared many other soldiers might be doing this too. He said the U.S. military should not allow this. Colin looked into the complaints. He said there might be some cases of mistreatment by U.S. soldiers, but he said mostly they got along well with the Vietnamese people. Some people say Colin did not look carefully enough into the soldiers' complaints. They say many of the complaints were correct. They say Colin and other leaders should have done more to make sure all U.S. soldiers followed the rules of war. What Colin learned in Vietnam. At first, Colin had felt excited and proud to be in Vietnam. He wanted to fight communism. It all made sense in those days, he said. But later, he felt U.S. leaders made poor decisions. He felt that was one reason the United States and South Vietnam lost the Vietnam War. Colin saw something else in Vietnam that bothered him. Many U.S. soldiers there came from poor families and minorities. But better educated or wealthy young men sometimes did not have to go to Vietnam. Colin wanted a military that treated all people fairly. He had learned the value of fairness as a boy growing up in the South Bronx. The South Bronx is part of New York. Chapter 2. A Poor Boy from the South Bronx. Colin Powell had little money as a child. He was not a good student. He didn't know what he wanted to be in life. His parents taught him that what mattered most was simply to do his best. What's the most important lesson you have learned in life? This is Colin's father. Mom and Pop. Colin was born in Harlem, New York in 1937. Marilyn, his older sister, was 5 at the time. Colin's parents were from Jamaica. They had come to the United States to make a better life. Colin's father, Luther, worked in the stockroom of a women's clothing maker. Later on, he was made a foreman. Luther never made much money. Colin remembers him as a small, neatly dressed, and hopeful. Colin's mother, Maud, had been a typist in Jamaica. In the United States, she worked as a seamstress. Colin said she was always busy cooking, washing, and ironing. She worried about money and the family. Do you know what a seamstress does? A seamstress is someone who makes clothing. And it said she was a typist in Jamaica. Today, she probably would work on a computer and do word processing. But before there were computers, people used typewriters. And so someone who worked on a typewriter was called a typist. Living in the South Bronx. After a few years, Colin's family moved to the South Bronx. They lived in a rough area. Gangs fought with each other. Drugs were on the rise. Many different ethnic groups lived in Colin's neighborhood. Colin grew up unaware of prejudice against African Americans. Everybody was a minority, Colin said. African Americans mixed with Irish, Poles, Italians, and Hispanics. Poles is a short form for Polish people. Every few blocks, there was a Jewish bakery, a Puerto Rican grocery store, or a Chinese laundry. So this is what an outdoor market looked like in South Bronx in 1946. Not a good student. Colin was not a very good student. He also did not star in music or sports, although he liked street games. To his parents, he seemed a bit aimless. Colin's sister Marilyn went to college. So when Colin finished high school, he decided to go to college also. He enrolled at the City College of New York. At college, Colin joined a military training program. Colin loved the uniform and the drills. He began to model himself as a cadet leader he admired, Ronnie Brooks. Colin had finally found something he enjoyed and was good at. He had found the military. Colin Powell found in college that he liked the military. This gave him something to work for. He later said, "That's what you really have to look for in life. Something that you like and something that you're good at." So sometimes it takes a while to find what it is that you really like and what you are good at. Chapter 3, a 4-star career. They're soldiers doing training exercises. Have you thought about life after high school or college? What would you like to do? Colin went into the Army after college. It turned out to be a good move. He received many promotions. That means he started here and then he got a promotion. He moved up and he kept going up. The slide for life. Colin had scary moments as a soldier. One came during training. Colin had to grip a hook attached to a pulley and slide along a steel cable across a river. The cable was strung between two large trees. The instructor pushed Colin to get him started. Colin rode down the cable toward the other side at terrifying speed. At the last second, the instructor yelled. Colin dropped 12 feet into the water below. Even today, Colin still calls this one of the most frightening experiences of his life. Discrimination. In the 1960s, the Army had strict rules against discrimination. But when he was away from the Army base, Colin found plenty of it. Late one night, Colin tried to buy a hamburger at a restaurant. He knew that the restaurant would not serve African Americans inside. So from his car, he ordered from the drive-thru. A waitress came out to his car. See, drive-thrus back in the 1960s were different than drive-thrus today. Today, you order and then you drive around, and right next to the building, you can pick up your food. But it used to be that you'd order at a microphone, but then a waitress would come out to serve you, and you didn't drive around, you just stayed parked. She asked Colin if he was a Puerto Rican. Then she asked whether he was an African student in the military school. When he said he was an American, she refused to bring his food. She told him he had to go behind the restaurant to get his food. Colin simply drove away. What would you do if someone refused to serve you just because you looked different? Colin became determined not to let bigotry affect him. Bigotry means when you dislike someone because they're different than you. Sometimes he felt hurt, sometimes angry. Mostly, he simply said to himself, "I'll show you. Germany, here I come." After training, the Army sent Colin to a U.S. base in Germany. He was still only a first lieutenant. Even so, the Army gave him command of a company. That's a company of soldiers. Colin wanted his soldiers to take pride in themselves. So Colin held contests among the soldiers. He says he learned that American soldiers love to win. They have a picture here from a store in 1964 where colored, meaning African Americans or people who weren't Caucasian, had to go in a different door to go into the store. Marrying Alma. When Colin returned to the United States, he met Alma Vivian Johnson. The two fell in love. They married in the summer of 1962. Soon after, Colin was promoted to captain and sent to Vietnam. After a year in Vietnam, Colin came home. He still barely knew his wife, and he had not yet seen his 8-month-old son, Michael. The Army asked Colin to teach at the infantry school. He had not taught before. He later said that learning to teach was the most useful lesson of his life. Turning point. Collins served again in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. When he returned, he earned a master's degree. Not bad for a student who did not do very well in high school. In 1972, Colin was chosen to be a White House Fellow. This was his first job in Washington, D.C. It would not be his last. Over the next 25 years, Colin would work for 4 U.S. presidents. He would learn a great deal about politics and government. Some lessons Colin had learned already. After the Vietnam War, many Americans did not trust their military. They did not feel proud of them. Colin wanted to bring back that trust and pride. He also saw that political and military leaders had to work closely together. Over the years, Colin has tried to make that happen. There's a picture of he and his wife when they got married. Leadership. Some students once asked Colin, what makes a good leader? Good leaders are people that other people trust, Colin said. You can trust good leaders to do the right thing, take care of other people, and to be selfless, and to be very loyal. How to succeed at war. Colin did well in government work, but he liked the Army better. He went to Korea as a battalion commander. He worked well with the soldiers there. In 1974, Colin again became a teacher. This time he taught at the National War College, NWC. He says he learned an important lesson there. The government, the public, and the military all have to agree on a war for it to succeed. This did not happen during the Vietnam War, he says. Playtime. Colin always worked hard. In his spare time, he liked to work on old Volvo cars. He found it relaxing to mess around with cars. Fatherhood also kept Colin very busy. He now had a son and two daughters. Serving the state. After the NWC, Colin commanded a division. He was now Brigadier General Powell, but Colin had proved he worked well in government too. For the next 18 years, Colin went back and forth between the army and the government. So here he is as a 4-star general. Since, let's see. Okay. Well, I'll keep reading. A job review. In May 1982, Colin's new commander wrote in Colin's job review, "Do not promote." Means don't have him go up. This general thought that Colin spoke out too often. Luckily, another general added a positive note to this review. Colin went on to be promoted many times. More hard work. Colin became a major general. He again worked in Washington, where he gave military advice to the government. But he had a soldier's heart. He left the White House again in 1986. For 5 months, Colin commanded 75,000 soldiers in Germany. He demanded hard work from his officers, but he also said, "Have fun. Don't run at breakneck speed. Take leave when you need it. Spend time with your families." Back to the White House. Colin's next call from the White House came from President Ronald Reagan. He wanted Colin to work with the National Security Council. Colin agreed. During this period, Colin helped with peace talks between the United States and the Soviet Union. The two nations agreed to cut the number of nuclear arms. They signed a very important agreement to cut arms in 1987. Colin left the White House in 1989 to take charge of all troops on U.S. soil. This was more than 1 million soldiers. So here's Colin Powell with former President Ronald Reagan. Youngest ever JCS chairman. Later that year, Colin made history. President George H. Bush asked him to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's JCS. This person is the top military advisor to the president and to the Secretary of Defense. Colin was the first African American named to this post. He was also the youngest chairman ever. Crisis. Almost right away, Colin had to handle a crisis. The president of Panama, Manuel Noriega, was accused of a number of crimes. Colin sent U.S. troops to Panama to arrest him and remove his government. Noriega fled, but later was caught. Few U.S. soldiers were killed or injured, so overall, the mission went well. But greater challenges lay ahead for Colin. Soon, the country of Iraq would attack the country of Kuwait. The fight called Desert Storm was about to begin. So here's a picture of him when he became the first African American to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So here's a picture of the Middle East. War in the Gulf. In 1990, Colin faced one of his biggest challenges. That year, a war broke out between two oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf. President George H. Bush asked Colin for his advice. What should the United States do? All about oil. Much of the world's oil comes from countries in an area called the Persian Gulf. Iraq and Kuwait are two of those countries. In 1988, Iraq had been at war for 8 years against Iran. Iraq had borrowed a great deal of money for this war. It needed more oil to sell to repay the money it owed. Iraq's President Saddam Hussein planned to invade Kuwait. One reason was he wanted the oil fields that he claimed belonged to Iraq. President Hussein also thought the United States would not defend Kuwait. Toward war. By July 1990, President Hussein's plan was clear. He had moved more than 100,000 troops close to the Kuwaiti border. Iraq was ready to attack Kuwait. At first, Colin hoped a strong warning might change President Hussein's mind. But then, 80,000 Iraqi troops crossed the border into Kuwait. This also put them close to oil fields in the country of Saudi Arabia. Here's soldiers in Saudi Arabia. A line in the sand. Colin talked to President Bush. He told the president that he should think of laying down a line in the sand concerning Saudi Arabia. Colin worried that Iraq would attack Saudi Arabia next. He hoped a firm warning might prevent this. The United Nations had already told Iraq to leave Kuwait. The UN, the United Nations, placed sanctions on Iraq. Sanctions are a way of putting pressure on one country to make them change their behavior. These punishments made it hard for Iraq to sell oil or trade with the rest of the world. But would this be enough? Colin wanted to avoid war if possible. Troops would be wounded and killed in a war. He advised the president to move more U.S. troops to the area. He wanted to stop Iraq from attacking Saudi Arabia. The United States offered 100,000 soldiers to help protect Saudi land. A huge buildup of troops. President Bush agreed to send more troops to the area. 2 months later, there were 184,000 soldiers to defend Saudi Arabia. President Hussein refused to give up Kuwait. In November, the United States sent 200,000 more troops to the area. 29 other countries also sent forces. U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf had to organize all these ground troops. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force made plans for bombing attacks. Colin explained the ground and air attack plans to the president. Colin wanted to send more troops and keep the sanctions. He wanted to do this rather than launch a bombing attack. But President Bush did not believe sanctions would work. A new plan of attack. Colin met with Schwarzkopf to go over the plans for a ground attack. Schwarzkopf was nervous about attacking too early without enough troops. But Colin promised him all the support he needed. The two generals put together a new plan. They explained it to the president. There would be a heavy air attack, then ground troops would invade. They thought that they would need 500,000 soldiers for the ground attack. Attack from the air. The U.S. president gave President Hussein a deadline. Iraqi troops must leave Kuwait by January 15th. The deadline passed. On January 17th, air attacks started. President Hussein ignored yet another deadline to leave Kuwait. On February 24th, Allied troops attacked on the ground. The Allies soon beat the Iraqi troops. Within 3 days, more than 70,000 Iraqi troops gave up and left Kuwait. The ground war lasted only a little more than 100 hours. Fewer than 400 Allied soldiers were killed. More than half of these Allies were killed by accidents or friendly fire. Many thousands of Iraqis died. The exact number is not known, but people guess that between 80,000 and 150,000 soldiers and between 100,000 to 200,000 civilians were killed. After the war, many Americans saw General Schwarzkopf as the main hero, but Colin was a very important planner. He made sure that the plan could succeed. Read on to find out what he did after the war. So Chapter 5, After the War. Colin has become an important leader in the United States. He tries to pass on the secrets of his success to others. He has some rules for living well. Can these help you in your life? Read on to find out. Speaking out. After Desert Storm, Colin went back to speak at his old school, Morris High School. The students were mostly African Americans and Hispanic. He reminded the students not to forget their heritage, but he also urged them to learn from other cultures. I remember the feeling that you can't make it, but you can, Colin said. You can be anything that you want to be, but wanting to be isn't enough. Dreaming about it isn't enough. You've got to study for it, work for it, fight for it with all your heart and soul. The center of attention. Colin became famous after the Gulf War. He did not seek the attention, but suddenly people wanted to know more about him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. Change of president. Bill Clinton ran against President George H. Bush for president in 1992. Clinton asked Colin to run for vice president, but Colin said no. Clinton was elected president. Colin stayed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a few months. Then he decided it was time to go. When he left, Colin received the Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. The president said, "I speak for the families who entrusted you with their sons and daughters. You did well by them, as you did well by America." So Colin Powell has worked for President Reagan, President George H. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Colin is chairman of the board for America's Promise, the Alliance for Youth. This group awards money to groups who help young people. America's Promise provides mentors for young people. It also gives them safer places to learn and grow. So here he is working with young people. George W. Bush became president in 2001. He asked Colin to be his Secretary of State. Colin accepted. He is now the president's main foreign policy advisor. Now remember, this book was written in 2003. So when this book was written, he was the foreign policy advisor. But that was 16 years ago, and he is no longer the foreign policy advisor. Colin helped handle the crisis when terrorists attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001. He is helping to organize efforts to battle terrorism. Colin's story. Colin rose from the streets of Harlem to high office. He did not let prejudice or bigotry hold him back. He offers young people a challenge and a hope. Some students once interviewed Colin. He told them, "Always try to do better. I'm very happy with my life, even when I've had things go very wrong. I learned from those experiences. Life has its ups and downs, and you grow with those ups and downs." So I would say that Colin Powell has a growth mindset that he's learned from ups and downs. There's an epilogue here. Colin's advice. We need to make sure that every kid in America understands that he or she is important, and we're going to try to make every one of them a success in life. It ain't as bad as you think. It will look better in the morning. Get mad, then get over it. Luck tends to come to people who are prepared. Have a vision. Be demanding. Be careful what you choose. You may get it. You can't make someone else's choices. You shouldn't let someone make yours. You have to do the best you can with what you have. So don't let any negative elements in your background be an excuse. Check small things. Share credit. Remain calm. Be kind. It can be done. So this is Colin Powell. Maybe you want to look him up and learn a little more about this man who has influenced many in the United States and all around the world as Secretary, what was it? Secretary of Defense. A Secretary of State, sorry, not Secretary of Defense. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little more about a great leader and some of the things he had to overcome. Being a leader isn't always easy, but if you, like he said, have a dream or have a vision and you prepare, you can overcome. So have a good night and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.